All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Sports Deep Dive podcast. This is Roger Harrison with the another episode of Sports Deep Dive. We take a look at sports, but we don't. We look mostly at players and teams and leagues and coaches and influencers. We don't look at the latest headlines because, well, there's other podcasts for that, and we uh, like to come to you for now commercial free so you can get on with your day. Today, I am joined by Brian Ingrassia, a professor at West Texas A&M University near Amarillo, Texas. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
I'm doing well, and I appreciate you being here. Now, back in 2012, Brian wrote the book The Rise of GridIron University," and that went to paperback in 2015. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right. All right. So I wanted to talk to you about that book. You started you started the book out, and I thought this was very interesting about a the scene was set in 1892, and you started out talking about Cal Berkeley playing this upstart school in football, which we would later to be known as Stanford University,
Mhm.
and that started that big rivalry. Um, you write that game had only about 6,000 spectators.
Yeah.
Um, so tell me more about 1892 in football between Cal and Stanford.
Yeah. That the 1890s was kind of the era when a lot of those big rivalry games were starting, in the South. You start to see what Auburn and UGA. In the Midwest, of course, University of Chicago starting up, and back before it was Ohio State, Michigan, it was Chicago, Michigan. And so on the West Coast, the big rivalry at that point in time, it still is, would be, they call it the big game, was Stanford Cal. And the reason why I started the book with that particular game, it's partly about the football, but it's also partly about kind of what's happening in American higher education at the time. Um, this is at a moment where there's all this money kind of flowing into universities. Leland Stanford, the railroad magnate out in California, he's starting up what we know of as Stanford University. And yeah, kind of what I'm saying there is that one of the ways that these two universities, kind of, uh, uh, express their presence there is it's partly through academics and research and all those things, but it's also partly through football. And so yeah, it's the book is really about those kind of the emergence of those of this moment where American universities start to realize that they can use football as a way to kind of reach out to the public. At the very same time that they're kind of the research and the things going on, they're getting more and more complex and kind of disconnected from the public. Well, football is kind of their way of reaching out to people who otherwise might not be all that interested in things that are happening there within the university walls, so to speak.
And you point out in the book that at the time, colleges and universities were more regional or more local, and that's the students that they drew from.
Yeah, I mean, in the 1890s and the early 1900s, we're looking at relatively small universities by today's standards. Probably the biggest university in the United States, let's say in 1900, is probably the University of Michigan or maybe Harvard, maybe Columbia, right? And we're talking institutions that are maybe 5 or 6 thousand students, which, compared to where I teach today is about 9,000 students or so. We don't think of ourselves as a very large institution at all. But back then, these are relatively small institutions. I mean, some do have a national profile, like a Harvard or a Columbia or something, but for the most part, these are institutions that are kind of, you know, back in the 1800s are serving, a more, I don't know if I'd say local clientele, but it's not the kind of thing we see today where there's U.S. News and World Report rankings and people
Right.
applying from all over the country and things like that. It is a little bit different landscape of American higher education at the time.
It was a professor at MIT, I believe, that you credit for thinking, we need to offer our students more than just exercising their mind. We need them to get out there and maybe exercise their body. And
Yeah.
that's when athletics kind of took hold there.
Yeah, I mean, you see sports, in colleges in one way or another going back into certainly into the early 1800s. There's this idea even before the Civil War, it's what they called mens sana in corpore sano. So it translates from Latin into a sound mind in a sound body. And the idea is that, yeah, if you want to have a good mind, you have to have a strong body for that mind. And, the YMCA kind of starts up around some of those ideas in the mid to late 1800s. Um, and so there is this idea even before the Civil War of students need to have strong bodies in order to be able to have strong minds. And then that really kind of takes off after the Civil War. You have the first what we would consider to be the first intercollegiate football game happening in November of 1869. The rules are different than what we would play today, but that's between Princeton and Rutgers in November of 1869. And then, it's railroads and things that make it so that students can travel from one campus to another and play those intercollegiate games, as opposed to just playing what we would today call intramurals on their own campuses. And so, yeah, it's really in probably by about the 1880s, 1890s, where you start to see lots of intercollegiate football. But it does kind of come out of that idea that students need to have strong bodies in addition to strengthening their minds.
It's funny you mentioned the YMCA because I graduated from Elon University and I was looking at their old schedules from when they started their football program, and one of their all-time opponents is the Durham YMCA.
Wow.
Yeah, they played I think I don't can't remember if they won or lost to that group.
Well, and if you go back and look at early schedules from, like, say, especially small colleges, I went to a very small college in central Illinois, and their first game was, I don't know, 1890 or 1891 probably, and it was against a local high school. Right. And this is the era before the NCAA. Nobody's really regulating this stuff. And so you might have a college playing a high school, or a college playing the YMCA or something like that. Yeah. And then
Right.
by 1906, you've got the NCAA, which comes in and starts not quite regulating things yet. That's a little later, but the things change a lot after 1900, 1905 or so.
Yeah, in an earlier podcast, when we were talking about Notre Dame independence and the rise of the Big Ten, we talked about the NCAA
Yeah.
coming together mostly then it seemed like the Big Ten presidents
Yeah.
were trying to form a regulatory type of committee. Um, so we're moving into the 1900s, and in your book, you kind of asked the question, or maybe it was me asking the questions about um, athletic departments. Are they athletic departments or are they public relations departments? And you talked about this was a way for the colleges and universities to reach out to their communities
Yeah.
through athletics and football. Um, and then as we get further into um, the 1900s with football's popularity and rising, and then we get into the academics versus football type of questions.
Mhm.
Did you want to address that?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you a little bit of how I came to write the book. There's this there was this, I started writing this, I don't know, 20 years ago or something, right?
Yeah.
Even though it came out in 2012. And there was this kind of prevailing idea amongst academics that, like, professors had always hated college football. That, like, there were all these kind of like pointy headed or like egghead intellectuals who just hated this idea of football. And there's some truth to that, right? If you go back to like the 1880s, there are like professors at Harvard who are like, this is terrible. We shouldn't be playing this. We should be focused on academics. And what I said is, I'm not quite sure that was always true. And certainly, if you look at some of the universities, like say University of Wisconsin, University of Illinois, some of the schools basically that came to the Big Ten. In the Big Ten's founded in 1896, thereabouts, about a decade before the NCAA. If you look at some of the schools, there's actually a significant number of professors, especially in fields like psychology and the social sciences, who say, no, actually, this is a good thing for our students. It's good for their brains. It's good for their bodies. It's good for our institutions. And there is kind of a moment around, early 1900s where there's a significant number of university professors saying, hey, this is actually a good thing. Let's not get rid of it. Let's try to reform it. And there's this perception out there that, Theodore Roosevelt tries to like ban football in 1905. It's way more complicated than that. And Roosevelt himself is a fairly minor figure in the whole national discussion about college athletics. But you do have these professors who are kind of like, hey, this is a good thing. Let's reform it as opposed to getting rid of it. And what I try to argue in the book is that essentially they come up with all these reasons for why football is a good thing. And they do such a good job of reforming college athletics that basically they make it such a permanent part of the American university that we could never get rid of it if we even wanted to. And I'm not saying
Right.
we should. I enjoy watching college athletics, but it becomes such a permanent part of our institutions of higher education because of these reforms that are created, between about, I'd say about 1905 and into about the 1920s or so.
And
But I
even
can talk more about those if you'd like.
125 years later, football is still the king as we get all these conference realignment and all these schools being added, and conferences like the Pac-12
Yeah.
kind of taken a step down. Um, Athletic directors and
Yeah.
coaches. There's a chapter on the coaches and ADs
Yeah.
and about how their roles have changed, for the past 100 years, 125 years. Um, Before when the Big Ten was getting out, some of like Michigan, for instance, was their first coach was just a student coach until they got quote a real coach. But how has the coaches and ADs changed throughout the 125 years that we've had college football?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think if you look at the late 1800s into the very early 1900s, the first few years, you really see kind of amateur coaches. Either they're students or alumni. Sometimes they would be called like graduate coaches. Famously, Walter Camp at Yale. He was one of the winningest coaches of all time for a
Right.
very long time, but he wasn't really a professional coach. He was a guy who, like, he was an executive at a local clock factory, and he came and coached the team. That starts to change, yeah, probably after about 1905 or so. You start to see people like Fielding Yost at Michigan. Of course, some listeners will know Yost Ice Arena, which started as Yost Fieldhouse there in Michigan, in Ann Arbor. It's people like that, these coaches, they start saying, no, we're not doing this kind of as a lark. We're not doing this as a hobby. We're not amateurs. We are professionals. And they very much one of the things I had a lot of fun doing when I wrote this book is, I was writing my dissertation at the University of Illinois, which has this huge library. I loved it, and they kept everything, and so there were all these books by football coaches from like 1905, 1910, 1920. And as far as I could tell, nobody ever written about these books before. And so I said, well, I'm going to read these books by these coaches from 100, 80, 100 years ago and see what they were saying. And basically, I mean, there's lots of X's and O's. There's lots of plays and practical advice in those books, but they always start them off with kind of this saying like, basically like here's how you watch a football game, or here's why we play football, here's why football is part of universities. And basically what I started seeing is that they were kind of positioning themselves as these professionals, these men who were especially suited to teach young men about character and discipline and morality. And then you read like a book like Fielding Yost's book, I think it's called for Player and Spectator or something like that. And he starts to make the argument. He's like, well, I'm not just teaching discipline to those, 11 young men on the field. I'm teaching discipline to everyone there in the stands. Everyone in the stands, if they're paying enough attention to the game and they're watching closely enough and they know the rules, they themselves can learn discipline through watching the game. And in a weird way, it's kind of like they're justifying their existence. They're like, well, I'm not just being paid to win a few games. I'm being paid to teach all of these spectators, coming into the university facility, the stadium, about these ideas of discipline. I'm not sure that always is what happens, but that's certainly how they positioned it. And then over time, probably the position of athletic director kind of goes from basically you have coaches who kind of run athletic departments, and then eventually the athletic departments themselves get big enough, especially by about the 1920s, that they need somebody running them. And somebody like a Fielding Yost or an Amos Alonzo Stagg at Chicago, they go from being just coaches to being these athletic directors. And so what you're seeing by the 1920s is there's this incredible kind of bureaucracy of college sports. You've got conferences, you've got the NCAA, you've got stadiums made out of concrete, athletic departments, professional coaches, all these things that kind of make it, like I say, into this, it's almost like its own department. The way the chemistry department is a department or the history department is a part of the university, while the athletic department's becoming its own kind of like bailiwick there within the university.
Right, and because the athletic department, like the school, is trying to raise funds. The school's trying to raise funds for academics. The athletic department's trying to raise funds for
Yeah.
athletics. And
And
so, go
yeah,
ahead.
and there was a time where, a lot of that money from sports, kind of went back into the university. I think today what we see is a lot of that money goes right back into athletics at a lot of places. And, other than the power conferences today, my understanding is a lot of universities are actually losing money on big time sports. That's probably not the case at Texas and Ohio State, Notre Dame. But yeah, back then there very much a clear sense the athletic department is earning money for itself, but also for the university too.
Yeah, Notre Dame, by going to the championship game uh, in football, is getting $20 million,
Yeah.
and they don't have to share that with anybody.
Yep. The benefits of being a standalone, huh?
Yes, I don't think they'll be joining a conference anytime soon.
Probably not. Although they tried. My understanding is they tried back in the earlier 20th century to be part of the Big Ten, and the Big Ten didn't want them.
That's right, and that was in a podcast that we had. Yes,
Excellent.
they tried many times. The Big Ten kept saying no. It was Michigan that kept.
Oh, Michigan.
Yeah. Um, Facilities and recruiting come into play in your book. Um, Everybody's trying to outdo each other. There was a time where I think University in Tennessee and University in Michigan were competing about how many people its football stadiums could hold.
Yeah.
Michigan would get bigger, and then Tennessee would match them,
Right.
and that type of thing.
Hmm.
Um, and I that that's going on to this day, and with recruiting and facilities and all that. But just touch
Hmm.
on that about how we get a game in 1892 of 6,000 spectators between Stanford and
Yeah.
Cal, and to today.
Yeah, I mean, some of those late 1800s games, they would occasionally play them at places like the Polo Grounds in New York, like Thanksgiving Day games, and they would have huge numbers of spectators. But you don't really see big on-campus stadiums until about the 19 teens. It's kind of right before World War I, you start to see, well, I take that back a little bit. 1903, Harvard builds Harvard Stadium right across the river in Boston. That's the first big reinforced concrete structure in the United States. I love to ask my students this question. I'll be like, what do you think is the first big reinforced concrete structure in the United States? And they're coming up with like dams and seawalls. And I'm like, nope, it's a football stadium and it's at Harvard in 1903. And then other schools start to follow. And
When
by the
did
way,
the Yale Bowl get
yeah,
started?
that's a great question. They build the kind of earliest incarnation of the Yale Bowl in about 1913 or so,
Okay.
right before World War One, and then I think after a few years later they expanded. So the current size is around 70,000 seats.
Yeah.
That's probably early 20s, but originally 30, 40,000 students, comparably sized to Harvard Stadium, which is still there, as is the Yale Bowl. And then the Ivy League schools, which of course are some of the early powerhouses, they start building these stadiums. Palmer Stadium at Princeton, Yale Bowl, Harvard Stadium. But then it's after World War One. That's when a lot of the state universities start building the really big stadiums. Illinois Memorial Stadium opens in 24, I think dedicated in 24. Stanford Stadium, Ohio Stadium, University of California Memorial Stadium. Those are some of the really big ones built right after World War One, and very frequently they are built explicitly as World War One memorials. Like, Illinois Memorial Stadium is a great example of this. It's very explicitly built as a memorial to students, faculty, staff, alumni who died in World War One, and they very much will market those facilities as war memorial stadiums. But if you actually dig around in some of the papers of like the fundraisers, they're talking about them partly about memorials, but it's partly we need to make sure that we can make as much money as possible off of this sport. We want to make sure that we don't lose a big game because our stadium only seats 20,000 people. We need a stadium that seats 70,000 people, let's say, or 60,000 people. So what's interesting is when I first started working on this project, I didn't think there was going to be, I wasn't anticipating a stadiums chapter. And then as I got into the archives and I started doing the research, I said, oh, stadiums are a huge part of this story. Um, and it is really interesting to see how these universities in the 1920s, they very much embrace big time football in particular. Basketball isn't quite a thing yet, the way we know it today, but they embrace it as a way to publicize themselves, to make money, all those things. Basically embracing popular culture. And I'm not sure that's always a good thing for these universities. In fact, I'm fairly critical of it, but it certainly is the way they're thinking when they are building these stadiums and creating athletic departments. And the NCAA is coming into the picture and so forth.
Well, and in today, even today, Northwestern's getting a new stadium,
Yeah.
and until that's being built, they're playing some of their games at Wrigley Field,
Yeah.
which is a throwback because I think in the early part of the 20th century they were playing games at Wrigley Field
Well,
as well
the
as the
the
Bears.
Chicago Bears played at Wrigley Field for about 50 years or so until they moved to Soldier Field. Yeah. It's fun watching. I grew up a Cubs fan and I've been to Wrigley Field a few times and it's fun on TV at least seeing those games. But yeah, Wrigley Field, you've got to wedge that football field in there to play
Yeah,
football.
and then most recently, I know this is off subject, but
Mhm.
they had the Big Ten hockey was playing some
Yeah.
games at Wrigley Field. Um,
It's funny because 120, 130 years ago, these reformers were saying we need to put the games on campus. We need to build facilities on campus basically so we can have more control over what happens at these games. We can make sure they don't become these kind of, pop culture spectacles played in New York City or Chicago or whatever. And now we're kind of moving back to that, right? When we see games played at Wrigley Field or other, other professional venues. I think those lines in a lot of ways, we're seeing the lines between college athletics and professional sport kind of blurring a little bit in recent years.
Well, I mean, and today some bowl games are played in professional stadiums,
Yeah.
not big. Well, I mean, there is one that's the Arizona Bowl, which is played at home of the Diamondbacks
Oh, wow. Yeah.
bowl game. All right, so we're in the last podcast. I don't know if you heard it or not. We touched on media and the NCAA. We're doing a
Yeah.
series on sports and media, and we talked about the NCAA, which, when television got involved, it kind of opened up the entire playing field, pardon the pun, of everything. You had the Sherman Anti Trust Act back in 1890, um, which the Supreme Court ruled that the NCAA was in violation of
Yeah.
in a case because they were controlling all the television inventory, and that included football as well. But then that in the mid to late '80s, that kind of opened up, and we no longer were watching Miami every week on CBS
Yeah.
Sports. Now we have wall to wall football from noon Eastern all the way to 10:30 at night.
Yeah.
Um, but you didn't really. I mean, your last chapter is the post World War One, but you really didn't touch on the television in respects to college football.
Yeah. What? When I originally wrote the dissertation the book's based on, I ended about 19 somewhere in the 1920s, and then when I was revising it into a book, I realized I needed at least go into the 1930s to understand some of the things I was trying to talk about. But since then, I've been very interested in that kind of later period you're talking about.
Yeah.
Especially, I've been talking with some of the folks who are involved in the North American Society for Sport History. We just call it NASH. That's the Sport History Conference in the United States and Canada primarily. And I've been really, really interested in exactly the things you're talking about, antitrust, media, and basically one of the things to keep in mind is that before about 1950 or so, well, let's say before 1948, the NCAA is not a regulatory agency. It's an advisory body. And things start to change after World War II. There's a number of scandals, there's point shaving scandals, and various other things. Also, like you just said, television comes into the picture right around 1950 or so. Um, and I'm working with an author right now, a well-established author named Ron Smith, who's wrote this great book on a guy named Walter Byers, who was the first executive director of the NCAA, starting around 1950 or so. And essentially, he comes in at a time when the NCAA is both trying, it's very paradoxical. They are both trying to make sure that students do not make money off of athletics, that they are not paid, they're true amateurs. At the same time, they realize there's a lot of money to be made off of television. But the NCAA is going to be the one that regulates exactly how much money is made, who's making the money, and so forth. And so, yeah, 1951, they do create this television agreement. And some schools are very much in favor of it, some aren't. And it lasts for about 20 some years until the College Football Association is founded in the 1970s. That's a group of big time football schools that are basically saying, hey, we could be making a lot more money off of this product that we're creating. And as some of the listeners may know, there's a very famous, or I should say a well-known court case where two of those schools, the University of Georgia and the University of Oklahoma, sue the NCAA, and they win in 1984. And I think that's exactly what you were talking about when the Supreme Court says you are violating antitrust law. And that's where we start to see the opening up of many more televised games, more money. That's right around the time that coaches, there's a lot of complicated changes happening in the 70s. Coaches go from being these kind of tenured professors who don't make tons of money to being free agents who can relatively easily move from school to school, making more and more money, partly because there's so much media money that's involved in those games. So it's a very complicated story, but it's fascinating what's going on in about the 1980s or so.
And the coaches seem to move to other programs when their current program gets under NCAA investigation.
Sometimes. Yeah, sometimes.
And they get away scot-free, and their old institution is
Uh,
it's punished.
Well, to keep your job nowadays as a college football coach, especially at a D1 school, you got to win games. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying they should be breaking those regulations, but the NCAA has a lot of regulations, and I know there's some coaches that realize, oh, the best way to win is to at the very least skirt some of those NCAA regulations.
But are the regulations with the name, image, and likeness,
Ooh,
are those regulations kind of, well, they're not gone, but are a bulk of them no longer relevant,
yeah.
I guess?
And this is okay. I always say I'm a historian. I probably understand the 1920s better than I understand the 2020s. So I'm kind of watching this and trying to figure out what's going on. What I will say, when the NCAA is founded in 1905, 1906, it's basically founded to correct or to fix a lot of the problems that are happening with intercollegiate football. And I like to somewhat glibly say that there's one problem from 1905 that the NCAA does a really, really good job of fixing. And that is the problem that college students might be making money off of their labor.
Right.
They do a really good job, especially after the 1950s, of making sure that what they call student athletes do not make money off of college sports. And I'm going to say something, I think probably some listeners may be aware of this, some may not. The term student athlete that we hear just all over the place every day if we're paying attention to college athletics, the term student athlete was created by the NCAA in the probably right around 1960, in the early 1960s, as a way to make it so that basically either the NCAA or universities would not lose worker compensation cases. There were a couple of worker compensation cases, especially coming out of Colorado in the
Hmm.
50s, where players or their families sued. They got injured or killed while playing or while traveling to a game. And initially they won. And the NCAA did a very, very good job of basically saying, no, these are not workers. These are student athletes. They're students first. They're athletes second. And we use that term without thinking today because the NCAA did such a good job of marketing this idea that these are amateurs. These are not professionals. So that was a bit of a digression from what I was saying. But I guess the idea is that the NCAA, especially in the mid 20th century, got very good at regulating how much compensation and what kinds of compensation those student athletes, as they said, could make off of sport. And I think ever since 1984, and I really, in some of the work I'm doing, I say that 1984 court case about TV, the NCAA versus Board of Regents of University of Oklahoma, that court case is a turning point. And it's partly there's a legal history story here because partly in legal theory, understandings of antitrust were changing a little bit in the 70s, and they were getting a little bit more. The courts were getting a little more specific about what exactly made an antitrust violation or so forth. And so, yeah, in 1984, the court is it's not a unanimous decision, but the court does determine that the NCAA is violating antitrust law, and that starts to become, I think, a legal precedent for some of these more recent cases about NIL and so forth. I'll be honest, I think we're moving to a direction where I don't think the NCAA can
Well,
maintain its power over amateur athletics the way they have for such a long time.
well, I was going to ask you to put on your Nostradamus hat and try to predict about what you think the future will bring for the NCAA and college football.
Yeah, historians are notoriously bad at predictions, so I'm probably going to be wrong about this. I do think we're going to see an era where if the NCAA doesn't disappear entirely, it's going to be much weaker.
Okay.
Right now, where the NCAA makes a lot of its money is from the college basketball tournament. Ever since about the 1970s or so, once the basketball tournament started being televised and they started expanding it to 32 teams, 64 teams, and beyond, that's where the NCAA makes most of its money, as my understanding is from that. It could be that we get to a point where the NCAA really is kind of the body for overseeing maybe the basketball tournament and some other sports. And I think it's entirely possible what we're seeing with conference realignment, which has been really, really just dramatic the last decade or so. I think we're seeing the Big Ten and the SEC trying to position themselves as kind of the arbiters of big time college football. And I don't know where that's going to end up. I really don't. And I will say that there aren't very many people who have studied the history of conference realignment, but that is something I've published on. And when conference realignment happens, it's because of how institutions of higher education are seeing themselves in relation to other institutions of higher education. And I think in this case too, it's about making money, right? I mean, the Big Ten through television. I mean, I was at the University of Illinois when they started up the Big Ten network a number of years ago, and they've figured out there's a lot of money to be made and publicity to be had. And like I said, I think the Big Ten and the SEC are trying to kind of battle it out over who's going to be that powerhouse. Pac-12 has pretty much already lost. I mean, they're trying to put that conference back together now, I think. I guess we have the Big 12 kind of in the Great Plains states and Texas, but we've got a few mega conferences now that are, I think, angling to gain much more power over college football.
Um, the Big Ten Network, which I think is the standard by all the conference networks. I think the Big Ten
Hmm.
and their partnership with Fox Sports does it right better than the ACC network or the SEC network or that type
Mm.
of thing. The
Interesting.
ACC network and the SEC network fall under the ESPN,
Hmm.
ABC, Disney umbrella. And right now, ESPN is giving the SEC lots and lots of money, as well as the ACC. Um, Do you do you think that the ESPN bubble will burst one day as far as, I mean, Disney has tons of money, but eventually they've got to dry up, right? Or not?
Yeah, and this is where my again, I could I could tell you better what's going on 50 years ago than today. ESPN starts what I think 1979, right
Yeah,
around then, and that
1970.
was a big factor I think in some of these changes. Right, there was more with cable television, which starts to emerge in about the 50s or 60s, becomes common in the 70s and 80s. There's a lot more money to be had, and that's where that 1984 court case is partly coming out of. I don't know much about ESPN today. I think maybe you're right. Maybe there is a bubble that's going to burst at some point. There's only so many college football games that can be televised. I do think there was a few years ago, I think they laid off a bunch of their staff, and I don't
Yeah,
remember details about
they
that.
yeah they did a few years ago, and they're in the process of just getting out another layoff. So they're continuing to lay off people.
So I wonder if maybe we've already seen a little bit of a bubble burst there with
Okay.
ESPN, but yeah, I can't say what will happen in coming years.
Now, West Texas A&M, where you teach now, is a Division two school. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
So, is the Division two culture similar to the early 20th centuries as far as athletics, or
Hmm.
different?
I'm gonna say not quite.
Okay.
A little bit of background. First, me, I went to a Division three college, a very small college in Central Illinois. Football is a big deal there, but there's no big athletic scholarships, no big stadium, anything like that. And then, I was at the University of Illinois. I taught at Georgia State right when they were starting up a big time football program about 15 years or so ago. I taught at Middle Tennessee State for a few years, which of course is a Division one, but not as high on the food chain maybe as some other D1 schools. Um, yeah, I mean, sports is a big deal out here in Texas, right? Football is. When I started here at West Texas A&M, we had one of the biggest, maybe the biggest D2 football stadium in the entire country.
Okay.
They've since built a newer, smaller stadium closer to campus. At one point in time, West Texas A&M was a Division One school, essentially. I have to be careful with how I use those terms because the divisions were only created in 1973, and probably the heyday of West Texas A&M's, or what was then called West Texas State, the heyday of their football was probably in the 60s, playing, New Mexico and other kind of big time schools. It's still a big deal out here, and there are scholarships, not the kind of scholarships you would see at Oklahoma or Texas or whatever. It's a big deal, and especially probably our volleyball team is probably the most successful team we've had out here. They win national championships and so forth. Um, but it'd be hard to say that it's the same kind of thing you would have seen 120 or 130 years ago. Partly because, again, I mean, like every other school, we have an NCAA compliance office, and we have all these regulations to follow, and um, it's basically just big time sports on a smaller scale. Our stadium maybe seats 10,000 as opposed to the, what, 100,000 or wherever you have at the University of Texas. So it's on a much smaller scale, but it's still a pretty, I don't know, a fairly commercialized thing and a big part of campus culture. Now, again, that's different from, say, a D3, a lot of D3 schools where I started out my college career. But that's a whole other discussion, probably.
I found out that because I follow the FCS,
Hmm.
which at one point was one double A.
Yeah.
Um, and fans of these FCS or D2 schools usually also have a um, power power four school that they also follow. Like you
Hmm.
might have a fan of West Texas A&M, and then they'll also be a fan of Texas A&M type of
Yeah. Or Texas Tech, which is our
yeah.
nearest D1
Okay,
school. Yeah.
so that's usually how it is. Um, well, this is that's all the questions I had. This has been very educational. I didn't know. I wanted to give you an opportunity for anything that else you wanted to discuss or talk about as far
Sure.
as your book.
I'll say one more thing. Kind of the main idea of the book was this idea that, again, there was this moment where growing universities in the early 1900s really embraced sport,
Right.
um, and reformed college athletics, especially college football, again, to the extent that I would say it becomes a permanent part of America's university culture. What I found was really interesting as I was revising the dissertation, turning into the book, and part of the reason why I felt like I had to go into the 1930s is because you start to see in the 1930s there are a lot of those professors who kind of start to back away from that idea. They start to say, "Oh, wow, we've kind of," I'm putting words in their mouth. They kind of realize they've created a monster that
Right.
they can't quite control, and that's when they start to back away and say, maybe this isn't what we should be doing. Maybe this should be on a smaller scale. And essentially, what happens is by the 30s, they can't, the genie's out of the bottle. They can't put it back in. And I think um, it was the research and the writing for this book was very interesting, but it's also in some ways it's kind of it's a sad story if you're somebody who really, values universities as places of higher education, because at a certain point, Woodrow Wilson has this saying back in the early 1900s where he says something like, the sideshows have taken over the circus, or something to that effect. And I think for those of us who are academics, we kind of look and say, well, for a lot of people, let's say the University of Illinois is not the Nobel Prize winning faculty and the massive library and all the amazing things going on in the classroom. It is the football team. It is the basketball team. Or, you could probably say the same thing about the University of Texas or the University of Tennessee, that for most Americans, that has become their one way of interacting with or understanding universities. And in some ways, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, when I look at all the injuries that happen in football, especially, I wonder if maybe that's the right thing for our young people to be playing. It's not necessarily a bad thing to enjoy the games, but it does get frustrating to see, well, for a lot of people, that is the university, that stadium, and the team with those colors and the mascot, that is the university, and the rest of the stuff kind of doesn't matter. And that's, as somebody who's both a sports fan and an academic, I wish we had a little better balance on some of those things. But I think that's probably the final thing I would like to say about my own research.
Well, it's funny because I mean, it seems that the ACC and the Big Ten are conferences that have always, and even to this day, have always stressed academics.
Hmm.
And just look at who the ACC has just added. They added Cal Berkeley and Stanford,
Yeah.
top notch institutions. And I'm
Not on
not
the
going,
Atlantic coast, though.
yeah, that's why they should change their name to the All Coast Conference.
That's probably true.
But I mean, I'm not throwing shade to the Big 12 or the SEC, but it's always been that, you know, if you go to an ACC school or if you go to a Big Ten school, it may be harder for you to get into that school academically unless you are playing a sport like
Yeah.
football or basketball.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the Big Ten has always, seen itself as very much an academic group of schools too. But I'm thinking about my time living in Georgia and Tennessee, and I would say, those I have a lot of respect for those SEC schools. I'm not going to say that maybe they have the highest. I don't know if they have the same requirements for all their athletes, but those are some good schools too. And I guess I wish that people understood, that let's say a University of Alabama or University of Oklahoma, it's not just the football and basketball team. There's a lot of really other, amazing stuff going on at those places. And of course, that's what those TV commercials that we see during games, that's what those are all about. But I don't know how many people are paying attention to those.
All right. Remind us again about your book.
Yeah, this it's called The Rise of Gridiron University, Higher Education's Uneasy Alliance with Big Time Football. Like you said, it was originally published by the University Press of Kansas in 2012. Came back out as a paperback in 2015, and I think there's copies out there if people are interested in reading it. Hope they want to.
And also, I want to talk to you in a future podcast about your book on the Indianapolis 500.
Yeah, I'd love to.
And then also, you said you were working on something now.
Yeah, I edit a journal now, and a lot of my time goes into editing the journal. But my next book is going to be on the history of Major League. Well, I shouldn't say Major League. I should say organized baseball expansion and franchise relocation. And a
Okay.
big part of that project is about antitrust law and how that affects expansion or non-expansion, as it may be. I've also been doing some work on conference realignment in college sports and those antitrust in that context too. But yeah, the big project's about baseball.
Well, let me know when that comes out, and I'll
Yeah.
read that and then have you back on for that as well.
Awesome. Look forward to it.
All right, where can people find you on social media?
I don't have a big social media presence, but I am on Facebook. Otherwise,
Okay.
yeah, I
Okay.
stay in my little hobbit hole a lot otherwise.
And I am on Blue Sky as 318 North. I am Roger Harrison, and this has been the Sports Deep Dive podcast. And Brian, I am grateful that you were able to join us today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right.